He slid into booth 3 believing 9 years had buried his mistake, believing names faded and debts expired. The room smelled of coffee and regret, and everyone expected the gun to speak first. Booth 3 sat against the wall, vinyl cracked, table scarred by years of careless meals. The man slid in slowly, back to the room, coffee already cooling. He believed 9 years had erased his outline. The diner was quiet enough to hear breath. Plates clinked. A waitress moved without looking twice. He kept his eyes down, hands steady, rehearsing a life where names no longer followed him. He told himself survival meant forgiveness. New cities, new papers, new habits. Distance had taught him confidence. Harlem, he believed, belonged to memory, not to him. Then the chair across from him shifted. No greeting. No accusation. Just presence. The air tightened, heavy with recognition. He knew before he looked who sat there, and what that meant. The gun appeared low, not raised, resting near a thigh. Close enough to be seen. Close enough to end everything. Booth 3 became smaller, boxed in by laminate and silence. Every lesson he'd learned about running failed at once. There was nowhere to go. No room to stand. No crowd to disappear into. Only the table between them, and the past catching up quietly. He waited for shouting. For threats. For the weapon to rise. That was how endings usually announced themselves. Instead, nothing happened. The man with the gun did not hurry. He didn't need to. Time had already done its work. 9 years had only stretched the distance between mistake and consequence, never broken it. Booth 3 held the pause. Coffee cooled further. The diner kept breathing. And in stillness, the informant understood he hadn't vanished at all. He had been allowed to arrive. Bumpy Johnson never chased ghosts. He let them come back on their own. Harlem taught him early that time did not erase betrayal. It only tested whether memory was patient enough to wait. Names changed. Faces aged. Streets shifted their rhythm. But the ledger stayed intact, written in trust and violation, not ink. Bumpy moved through the years without revisiting old wounds aloud. He didn't warn. He didn't threaten from a distance. He believed reminders weakened authority. If a man truly disappeared, Bumpy let him stay gone. If he returned, that meant something else entirely. Loyalty in Harlem wasn't loud. It lived in routine, who stood where, who spoke when spoken to, who was allowed to sit without explanation. Bumpy enforced that order by protecting it. He corrected quietly. He forgave carefully. And when forgiveness was not earned, he did not pretend otherwise. The informant's name never came up in conversation. That absence was deliberate. Silence kept the balance. It allowed life to continue without dragging the past behind it like a chain. But silence did not mean forgetting. Bumpy understood that betrayal revealed itself eventually. Men grew tired of running. Fear softened into carelessness. A city always called them back, through habit, through hunger, through the false comfort of familiarity. When word reached Harlem that a familiar outline had reappeared, Bumpy did not react. He listened. He measured. He let the information settle like dust. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge was noisy. This was about principle. A community could survive many things, but not broken trust left unanswered. If betrayal went unaddressed, order weakened everywhere. So Bumpy allowed the moment to form naturally. No pursuit. No signal. Just patience. By the time Booth 3 came into view, the decision had already been made, not in anger, but in alignment with rules older than the diner itself. Bumpy didn't need to be present to be felt. His authority moved ahead of him, shaping the space, preparing the ground. The man across the table sensed it, though he could not name it. That was how Bumpy operated. He let time narrow choices. He let memory do the heavy lifting. And when a man finally sat still enough to be found, Bumpy Johnson ensured the lesson arrived calmly, exactly when it could no longer be avoided. 9 years had taught him how to disappear without vanishing. New cities first. Then new names. He learned which questions not to answer, which habits to break, which memories to keep sealed. Survival became a discipline. Fear, a routine. At the beginning, he slept lightly. Every sound felt like a knock. Every shadow held shape. He avoided mirrors, avoided crowds, avoided stillness. Movement made him feel safe. Distance felt like protection. But time has a way of dulling edges. Years passed without consequence, and fear slowly softened into something more dangerous, confidence. He began to believe that silence meant absolution. That no word from Harlem meant the account had been closed. He convinced himself that Bumpy Johnson ruled a moment, not a memory. He took small risks. Sat longer in cafes. Let conversations linger. Spoke old names carefully, then more freely. He stopped looking over his shoulder every time a door opened. What he never understood was that hiding only worked if the other side was hunting. Bumpy never hunted. He waited. The informant didn't know when he was noticed again. There was no signal. No warning tremor. That was the mistake, believing danger always announced itself. Harlem didn't need to shout across distance. It only needed to recognize a familiar outline stepping back into view. By the time he returned, he believed himself changed. Older. Smarter. Less important. He thought age softened consequence. That years acted like forgiveness. They didn't. 9 years had not erased what he had done. They had simply allowed it to settle deeper. Betrayal aged differently than guilt. It grew quieter, more patient, more precise. When he sat in booth 3, he believed the past had been outrun. What he failed to see was that the past had never moved at all. It stayed where it was, waiting for him to slow down. That was the trap of time. It made men careless. It made them confuse absence with mercy. Bumpy Johnson understood this better than anyone. He trusted time because time always brought men back to themselves. And when it did, there was no need for pursuit. Only recognition. The informant's 9-year escape had not been a victory. It had been a delay. And delays, Bumpy knew, only sharpened the lesson waiting at the end. Booth 3 held them close, closer than either man would have chosen. The table was narrow. The aisle behind was tighter. The diner was not built for confrontations, and that was precisely why it worked. No exits worth reaching. No space to stand tall. Just a seat and the weight of what followed. The gun rested where it could be seen but not used. Low. Casual. Final. It didn't move because it didn't need to. Its presence was enough to collapse every version of escape the informant still carried. He searched the room for witnesses and found none that mattered. People ate. Cups were lifted. A waitress passed by without slowing. The world refused to acknowledge the danger, and that made it unbearable. Violence he understood. Indifference stripped him bare. The man across from him did not stare. He didn't need eye contact to dominate the space. He watched reflections in the chrome trim, listened to breathing, measured tremors in hands that tried to stay still. This was not anger. It was control rehearsed over years. The informant's mouth opened once, then closed. Words crowded his throat but none survived the silence. Apologies would sound small here. Explanations would insult the moment. He understood suddenly that nothing he said could improve his position. The gun remained where it was. The stillness stretched. Each second pressed harder than the last. This was not an interrogation. It was an accounting. Time folded in on itself. 9 years collapsed into one narrow table. Every lie he told himself came undone. He wasn't being punished for running. He was being shown that running never changed ownership of truth. At a nearby booth, someone laughed softly. The sound cut sharper than a threat. Life continuing around him confirmed what he feared most: this moment was ordinary to everyone else. He was the only one who felt exposed. The man across from him shifted slightly, just enough to remind him that movement belonged to the one who had earned it. The gun did not rise. The silence did. The informant finally understood why no one had chased him. Why no warning had ever come. This was never about speed. It was about certainty. About knowing that eventually, he would sit still long enough to be found. Booth 3 had become a courtroom without a judge, a sentence without words. And as the coffee went cold between them, the truth settled fully into place. Nothing needed to happen. Everything already had. Bumpy Johnson arrived without ceremony. Not through the front door. Not announced. He took the space the way he always did, by belonging to it before anyone noticed. The man in booth 3 felt it before he saw it. The room adjusted. Postures shifted. Voices lowered half a note. That change carried more force than any raised weapon. Authority had entered quietly, and it did not need to look around to know where it stood. Bumpy did not sit immediately. He paused beside the booth, close enough to be present, far enough to make the point. His face was calm, unreadable. No anger. No satisfaction. Just certainty. He looked at the informant once. Not with accusation. With recognition. 9 years collapsed in that glance. Bumpy did not mention the betrayal. He didn't name it, didn't frame it, didn't relive it. He understood that explaining weakened judgment. The man across from him already knew why this moment existed. Saying it aloud would only offer comfort. The gun remained low. It had done its work. Violence was never the message, consequence was. Bumpy spoke quietly, just enough to carry across the table. His words were few. Measured. Not a threat. A reminder. He talked about order. About how communities survived by knowing who could be trusted. About how some debts didn't age, they waited. The informant listened without interruption. He didn't nod. He didn't argue. He understood that this was not a negotiation. It was a closing. Bumpy let the silence return after he finished. He respected it. Silence had carried him this far. It would carry the lesson forward. When he finally sat, it was only for a moment. Long enough to make the scene complete. Then he stood again, already finished. The gun was tucked away. The booth felt wider. The air lighter. Judgment had been delivered without spectacle. Bumpy did not look back as he left. He trusted what remained behind him. He trusted that memory would do the rest. The informant stayed seated long after. He didn't touch his coffee. He didn't move. He understood now that survival did not mean escape. It meant living with what you'd done. The diner returned to its rhythm the way it always did, quietly, without asking permission. Plates were cleared. Chairs scraped. Someone paid at the counter and left without looking back. Booth 3 remained occupied, but the moment had already passed. The informant stayed seated longer than necessary. Not out of fear now, but understanding. He had been allowed to remain. That distinction mattered more than any threat. Leaving alive was not mercy. It was consequence stretched over time. Bumpy Johnson did not send anyone to follow him. He didn't need to. What had been said, and what had not, would travel farther than footsteps ever could. The lesson was complete the moment it was understood. Word moved through Harlem the right way. Not as gossip. As alignment. People spoke carefully about loyalty again. About trust. About how some lines never faded no matter how long they were left alone. The city adjusted itself without instruction. The informant did not disappear a second time. He lived smaller. Quieter. His confidence never returned. He understood now that survival came with memory attached, and memory carried weight. Bumpy returned to routine. He checked on people. Settled disputes before they hardened. Protected balance the way he always had. Booth 3 became just another place again. That was the point. Order restored without spectacle. Years later, details blurred, as they always do. Some said the gun was raised. Others said it never moved. Some swore Bumpy spoke longer. Others said almost nothing was said at all. Those arguments didn't matter. What endured was the principle. Betrayal did not escape time. It only waited for the right table, the right silence, the right moment to be answered. Bumpy Johnson did not need revenge to rule. He ruled by making consequences inevitable, and survivable. Harlem remembered that. And because it remembered, it stayed standing. That was the real cost of betrayal. Not death. But living with the truth once it finally sits across from you. If this moment meant something to you, don't let it end here. Subscribe. We tell the Bumpy Johnson stories that were buried on purpose. The quiet moments of power, the resistance no one wanted recorded. And the lessons our people passed down without applause. These stories weren't loud. But they lasted.